Episode 22 brings us just the beginning of the Turning Point's aftermath. And while I'm sure a lot of you are curious to know how the big moment went in the novels, the most important cut content actually comes before that. Not only were we given a lot more details behind the Fatoa region's current situation, but there was also a whole subplot behind the reason for Philemon's interest in Eris. A very important topic that the anime didn't mention at all. So let's do as we usually do and take a look at everything that we missed from the novels. But first, this video is sponsored by Another Eden, a classic single-player JRPG experience brought to you by the talented creators behind the Chrono series. With the main story that's written by the veteran Masato Kato himself, you can definitely expect a narrative that's on par with his previous works like Chrono Trigger, especially in his most recent edition of the Chrono Cross Complex Dream crossover story. So, not only does that mean plenty of exclusive Chrono Cross story content and features, but also a whole new roster of crossover characters to play with, all of which are completely free to unlock just by playing. So, with no gacha or paywall behind any of them, you'll be able to focus on reliving that classic Chrono Cross experience. There's that familiar theme of parallel worlds, appearances by iconic characters like Lynx and Glenn, and even an exclusive soundtrack overseen by the same composer who created the original Chrono series soundtracks. It's a crossover that has pretty much everything that went to make Chrono Cross the highly acclaimed sequel it was. So, if you're interested in one of the best JRPG experiences currently available, then be sure to use the link in the description to download Another Eden for free on mobile or desktop today. But now, let's get back to the video. Episode 22, Dreams and Reality, covering the last two chapters of Volume 6 of the light novel. 3 days after the events with Orsted, and the three of them had finally made it back to the Asura Kingdom. The remaining journey wasn't necessarily different from how it was before, but things did seem a little bit gloomy. Well, that and Eris seemed to treat Rudeus slightly different now. You see, not only did she start staying much closer to Rudeus' side, but she also became much more passive with regards to his antics. Things that she would normally end up punching Rudeus for were no longer met by a fist but instead a glare. Then, unlike how she would normally just leave him alone after, no matter what weird thing Rudeus seemed to do, Eris just kept herself close. It was getting to the point where if Rudeus' hands were left completely free, then it was only a matter of time before they ended up in Eris' direction. So, part of the reason we see Rudeus practicing his disturb magic was actually because this was to help him keep his hands off of her. As for the way this magic worked, well, the concept was simple but implementation difficult. Any source of mana from which magic was being cast could simply be targeted and disrupted by a different kind of mana. It was a method of nullification very similar to the King Tier barrier in the Shirane Kingdom. What made using it so extremely difficult, though, was the seemingly countless rules that came with applying it. Sure, Rudeus could partially disrupt the formation of his own stone cannon, but that still didn't completely stop the spell as a whole. At best, he could only apply an imperfect restraint, not an absolute nullification like how Orsted did. If Rudeus could figure out the extent of these rules, though, then he was certain a whole new world of possibilities would open up for him. Perhaps he could figure out a way to prevent having his magic sealed again, or maybe even create a spell that could negate Orsted's disturb magic. Whatever it was, Eris was in awe over just how amazing it was, much to the point that she felt the need to ask why Rudeus was so strong. This wasn't really a question that Rudeus could answer, but he did understand that the cause of it was her previous encounter with Orsted. I mean, being defeated by a single attack certainly wasn't good for her confidence, so it only made sense that she now felt inferior. Of course, no one could blame her for losing to the Dragon God, but that wasn't an aspect Eris was even considering. All she could focus on was how she failed. It was the complete opposite mindset of what Rudeus had, a mindset that she simply couldn't understand. Now, that's not to say Rudeus was treating his almost fatal encounter lightly, but it was the surreal nature of it that made him understand just how outclassed he was. He was now well aware of exactly how high this world's ceiling of power went. So, if him and Eris were going to survive their next encounter with a person like Orsted, then Rudeus knew the two of them would need to get stronger. Not strong enough per se to defeat that person in a fight, but just strong enough for them to be able to escape together. That was the lesson that Rudeus had learned from this. His focus was now centered on survival over anything else, all because he didn't want to almost die next time. It was after Rudeus had told Eris this that he also went on to say how he was going to work hard for her. If there ever did come a time where an opponent was too much for them to handle, then Rudeus said he'd be strong enough to pick her up and make a run for it. It was a statement that had left Eris with quite a bit to think about. Moving on to Rudeus's conversation with Rudeus, the first thing they had talked about was actually Orsted. According to Rudeus, This was the first person since Laplace in which, with only a single glance, he could clearly see just how outmatched he was. There was a bloodthirsty aura that emanated from his entire body, something that made WRIGHT know he simply couldn't win against him. That didn't make his defeat any less regrettable, but he did understand just how lucky they were to survive. That's why we see a certain disappointment in WRIGHT's demeanor here. He was actually upset that Rudeus had tried to interact with a person everyone else was so very cautious of. That being the case, WRIGHT made sure to stress that if that situation was to ever happen again, then avoiding all contact was an absolute necessity. It was the most important lesson that Rudeus needed to take away from this. As the two went on to discuss the topic of the man god and curses next, we actually find out that curses are permanent. You see, when it comes to a person that's been born with one, there's zero conceivable methods of getting rid of it. That's why people like Orsted are cursed to bear theirs forever. What makes WRIGHT fundamentally different though is that his wasn't one that he was born with. The fact that his was transferred instead of being innate makes it a bit more believable that it could actually be fading. So, despite this notion coming from someone as shady as the man god, it was still something that WRIGHT could find solace in. Rudeus just made sure to add that it should be considered with a grain of salt. Now, 1 month later, and the three had finally arrived at the Fatoa region. They were right outside the entrance to the refugee camp when WRIGHT abruptly declared that his duty was over now. As much as Rudeus wanted him to stay, he wasn't so sure that WRIGHT would even want to. He couldn't help but feel that he himself was much more of a burden than WRIGHT was willing to put up with. So, as Rudeus went on to say how they wouldn't have made it without him, WRIGHT then went to proclaim otherwise. Yes, Rudeus did make his fair share of mistakes along the way, but so long as he was able to recognize that that's what they were, then WRIGHT was confident that he'd be just fine. Especially since he'd been able to demonstrate the whole great power, great responsibility type thing. You see, one of the things that WRIGHT found the most impressive was that despite Rudeus possessing this great talent which placed him on a pedestal, not once did he ever let it get to his head. That was the key thing that allowed WRIGHT to accept Rudeus as a warrior now. It was even after he had heard all that though that Rudeus still wanted to list out all his other weaknesses. To him there were just so many other things that made him feel the opposite. But even he was self-aware enough to know just how pathetic that would be. So rather than grovel in his own weakness, Rudeus instead chose to stand with his head held high, only lowering it to bow as a sign of gratitude. It was as he was starting the motion though that WRIGHT quickly moved to stop him. There was no need for Rudeus to show his gratitude since WRIGHT believed that Rudeus had done enough in exchange already, bringing us to the start of their conversation in the anime. Most of it was pretty much the same, but the one thing that we did miss out on was what WRIGHT was planning to do after. Apparently he was going to look for any remnants of the Spurred in the central continent. Restoring the honor of his tribe wasn't something he felt he could do alone. Then if he did happen to have some free time, then he also said how he would try and look for Zenith. That was the path that WRIGHT was going to walk now. Moving on to Eris's abrupt return to reality, there's a bit more context that needs to be given behind the deaths of Philip and Hilda. You see, despite the two not being teleported very far, they were unfortunately displaced to an area known as the Conflict Zone, a convoluted region located to the east of the mountains where numerous smaller nations were constantly at war for control over the territory there. So, for nobles like Philip and Hilda to end up there, well, that was pretty much a death sentence for them. Unless they had managed to meet up with Ghislaine immediately after teleporting, then there was very little chance for the two of them to make it out of there. Now, not much is said about how they died, but the lack of words from Ghislaine was enough to indicate that it wasn't pretty. The manga does hint at what could have happened, but the true fate of Philip and Hilda was never actually described to us. Instead, we're meant to decide for ourselves based on Ghislaine's frustrated demeanor. Because her expression was so clearly filled with remorse and resent, it was more than enough to fill Rudeus's head with all sorts of unpleasant assumptions, something the anime unfortunately doesn't quite show us. When it came to the topic of Saros next, despite Rudeus letting his emotions get the best of him, he did also understand why some would see his execution as necessary. He understood that the people needed someone to blame. So, if the kingdom wanted to soothe the people's discontent, then executing Saros was certainly the best way to do exactly that. It was the same idea as the Japanese Prime Minister resigning when something shameful happened. Of course, Rudeus was also certain there was some sort of power struggle, but the extent to which it was involved was something he couldn't even begin to imagine. The lack of any sort of attempt at re-establishment was all Rudeus needed to see to know that the kingdom didn't really care about the incident. It was quite obvious that politics was more important than the people. What went to bug Rudeus the most, though, was that despite there possibly being hundreds of thousands of casualties, the kingdom still decided to take the life of a man who had lived. Someone who had made the efforts to return back from where he was displaced was just executed without any sort of regard for that. It made Rudeus think that perhaps the kingdom didn't truly understand just how severe it all was. After that whole discussion was over, there was a little bit more to the scene regarding the status of Sylphie. You see, the fact her name was crossed out but not on the list of dead was actually a confirmation that she was alive. Someone had either spotted her and crossed her name off the list, or Sylphie herself had come through but didn't leave any contact information, likely because she hadn't yet settled down anywhere. Whatever the actual reason was, Rudeus was extremely relieved to know she survived. He was a bit worried that her hair would attract some negative attention, but he was also sure that she was strong enough to defend herself. Paul had even said how she was able to silently cast healing magic now, so that alone made her more than capable of surviving on her own. As for what she was doing, well, that's the question Rudeus kept asking himself. He did have a few potential ideas in mind, but the most likely was the one where she was searching for her family. It's likely she didn't yet know that they had died and was currently out scouring the continent for them. Once Rudeus had put Lilia and Aisha onto the list of survivors, there was an entire scene after that didn't make it into the anime. A private discussion between Alphonse, Ghislaine, and Rudeus, basically discussing the full extent of Eris's 3-year journey. It was after that story was given, though, that we then get to a far more important discussion. One that starts off with Alphonse saying how they were the only 3 remaining. Of all the people who had once served Lord Saros, it was him, Rudeus, and Ghislaine that was all that was left. This was a bit surprising considering how many maids Lord Saros had, but it was likely that any beastfolk formerly employed under his name was either dead or back in their homeland. So, given that this was the dire state of the Boreas Grey Rat family, Alphonse decided it was best to start building it up again. And his first step to doing so was to make Rudeus a vassal of it. His achievements and wit showed he was more than mature enough to take on the position. It was also the only way Rudeus could take part in the ensuing conversation about Eris's future. The first thing that we learned from this rather crucial exchange was that Eris did actually have some family remaining. Lord James, who was the current liege lord of the area, was supposedly already sheltering Eris's brothers and cousins. So this would have been a great potential place for Eris to stay, had James not already implied that he didn't want her to. Because Eris wasn't the ladylike noble that everyone expected her to be, it was unlikely that any noble who cared about their image would take her. They just couldn't view her as one of them. That being the case, the only other option was then Philemon. As Paul's younger brother and the current head of the Notos household, he was the only noble willing to take her. What made even Alphonse hesitant to take this offer, though, was the troubling rumors of Philemon trying to gain favor with High Minister Darius. You see, Darius wasn't quite the upstanding individual. Despite his rapid increase in political power, it was his schemes that had driven the second princess out of the country, a person who Philemon was once a massive supporter of. As soon as that princess was out of the picture, though, Philemon had quickly started to make moves to the winning side, one of which is the scheme we see here to make Eris his concubine. Now, just like Rudeus, you're probably wondering how exactly that would gain favor with High Minister Darius. Well, to explain that, we actually have to go back to episode 5, back to the night when Eris and Rudeus were kidnapped. This may come as a bit of a surprise, but Darius was the one who had orchestrated it. On his single and only visit to the Fatoa region, one glance was all it took for Darius to develop a perversion towards Eris, leading him to go so far as to try and kidnap her. It didn't take long for Saros to find out that he was the culprit, but Darius's influence made him practically untouchable. There wasn't anything Saros could do to retaliate, so instead the whole thing was just swept under the rug. But now that you know that this was what had happened, I'm sure you've pieced together exactly why Philemon wants Eris now. It's more than likely that the moment he gets his hands on Eris, he'll immediately go and try to send her off to Darius, leaving Eris to a horrible life with a perverted noble. Unlike how Rudeus completely rejected the idea though, Alphonse was only looking at the bigger picture. Yes, Eris would have to put up with a filthy man of a husband, but her newfound power would place her in a position to help restore the Fatoa region. Like, if she went and made a request to develop a new village in Fatoa, then Alphonse was positive Darius would see to it. That was the value that came with this proposal. It was the most beneficial for the people the Boreas Grey Rats were once responsible for. When Rudeus went to ask Elaine what she thought next, he was actually surprised to hear her say that Eris should be with him. Then even more so when Alphonse didn't completely disagree with it. You see, Palamon wasn't Eris's only path to nobility. There was actually one more that came in the form of Rudeus. Since Paul had accomplished so much good during the whole displacement incident, the initial steps for Rudeus to gain influence were already laid out for him. The only problem was getting the Liege Lord James to allow it. Ghislaine did also recommend to just run away, but that was an option Alphonse simply couldn't accept. He refused to leave the people of Fatoa to suffer. So, if that meant that he had to offer up Eris, then that was a sacrifice he was willing to make. Which finally brings us to this divisive moment that we saw in the anime. Now, while Rudeus did understand where both sides were coming from, at the end of the day it didn't really matter. The decision on what Eris was going to do was ultimately going to be decided by Eris herself. No one else had any right to tell her otherwise. So, with that bringing this meeting of vassals to its end, the next scene is the one I'm sure a lot of you weren't quite expecting. It was a very delicate moment that needed to be treated very carefully. Not just because of the act that was being portrayed, but also because of the emotions that needed to be portrayed with it. The scene needed to be able to show both Eris and Rudeus' state of mind. So, for them to be able to do just that with the very little dialogue given, well, that just goes to show how masterful the direction was. What I will add to give a bit more context though is that while Rudeus did think he loved her and did think he wanted to start a family, he never once stopped to consider how Eris felt. He would spend the whole night thinking about what their future together would be like, but never once consider how he would help her get through the present. It didn't cross his mind to wonder at all what Eris was thinking. Now, in the morning after, the only thing worth mentioning is the way the novel translated the letter. You see, rather than use the word well-matched, the novel instead translates it as well-balanced, which may not seem like it means much right now, but once we get Eris's perspective in the next episode, I'm sure it'll make a lot more sense for you. In any case, that's everything that we missed from the episode. So if you liked what you saw and want to see more, then be sure to subscribe so you know when the finale comes out next week. I'll also be doing another post-episode discussion on Twitch on Sunday, so hopefully you guys can make it out to that one as well. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Another Eden once again for sponsoring this video. If you're a fan of classic JRPGs with highly immersive stories, then I highly recommend using the link in the description to download it for free today. Even if you don't know too much about this Chrono Cross crossover, there's plenty of other content to explore as well. Numerous other stories from past crossovers with games like Persona and the Tales of franchise. So there's definitely hours and hours of content to get through. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!